We are near the end of the Republic. A revolution has begun, and no decisive counter-revolutionary actions have been ordered. Why has this happened? Because we have been psychologically and linguistically disarmed. The oath of allegiance of federal officials is to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. But if we refuse to acknowledge the existence of enemies, if we cannot name our enemies, no defense will be possible. And this is the one thing above all that has been forbidden. We are not allowed to name our enemies. This is the raw essence of linguistic and psychological disarmament. Add to this a process in which America's enemies have flooded into the government itself. And now, when mob violence has been deployed on a massive scale, the country finds itself unprepared, disoriented, and defenseless. How did we get here? Leftists have gradually taken control over the curriculum of our schools. This curriculum was copied from designs made in the USSR for our express use. This curriculum destroys the mind's ability to work competently with abstractions. It leads our children away from patriotism. It leads women to turn against men, blacks to turn against whites, and Americans to turn against their own country. It is a very simple process of indoctrination that nobody has seriously challenged. We have supported this treason ourselves with lucrative funding. In consequence, we have been gradually losing control of our own institutions, decade after decade. And that is how we came to this tragic moment in time. The phrase that best describes this overall process is psychological and linguistic disarmament. We have been intellectually disarmed, and now the process has advanced from the realm of ideas to street violence. If the process is allowed to continue, Americans of all races and beliefs will be slaughtered when the foreign enemy moves his missiles, armies, and fleets into action. At present, our economy is under attack on a number of fronts. Law and order is being stripped from us. First, the police will be defunded. Second, the revolution will defund the U.S. military. Third, the Chinese and the Russians will bomb and invade the country. Consider the following occurrences. Around the country, police officers are kneeling before protesters, begging forgiveness. Whites in the suburbs are also kneeling before blacks. An appeasing spirit has taken hold of a neutered middle class. It is a portent of impending mass expropriation. It is a portent of atrocities, killings, massacres, arbitrary arrests, rampaging mobs, foreign invasion, and military dictatorship. In blue states, Marxist revolutionaries are using black anger to cover an attack on the country's economy, to take over the streets, to burn and loot businesses, to intimidate the government and subdue the populace. As of this moment, their strategy is working. If the government does not take back the streets and stop the destruction of property, the revolutionaries will begin to dictate terms. In that event, every negotiation will go against the government until the revolutionaries are the government. Presently, The revolutionaries demand that the prisons be emptied and police disbanded. This will assure their control of the streets indefinitely. It will allow them to use force at will to confiscate property and commit extrajudicial killings. The revolutionaries will form their own government, modeled after Robespierre's Committee of Public Safety. There are many who will say, in response to what I have just stated, that I'm exaggerating the present troubles. They'll say that my anti-communist prejudice has led me to a distorted view of events. They'll argue that these protests are peaceful and not about Marxism at all, but have to do with white privilege and systemic racism. While many protesters are genuinely worried about police brutality and systemic racism, they are but pawns and a screen for the revolutionary left to conduct its violent attacks. Many good and generous people believe in a leftist utopia of love and peace. But theirs is an upside-down world in which all facts are seen through the ever-inverting eyeglass of ideology. Sadly, they're ignorant of the actual forces manipulating them. Their knowledge of history and politics is too limited for safe involvement in controversies that they don't fully understand. Vladimir Lenin had a name for these good people. He called them useful idiots. The present riots have little to do with white racism and everything to do with Chinese and Russian war preparations against the United States. The left in this country, wittingly or not, is the cat's paw of foreign powers. To not realize this is to be a political child. It signifies ignorance. The battle cry of systemic white racism is a theme fronted by our enemies. This theme has always been supported by Beijing and Moscow. It is supported for strategic purposes that are now coming into focus. Whatever our domestic problems may be, kneeling before a protest that's used as a screen for communists and foreign enemies is suicide. If we bend the knee to this, nothing will go back to normal. There's a video of vandals breaking into a business. The people inside are shouting, "We're on your side! We're on your side!" But the vandals don't stop. They proceed to smash everything in sight. Many of our politicians and military leaders are sympathetic to the protesters. They're afraid to use force against rampaging looters and incendiaries. And so the looting, the burning, and the violence will continue. The revolutionaries are emboldened primarily by a weak response, a response reminiscent of the French monarchy of 1792. It is a dangerous task to defend weak governments. Such governments are never steadfast. They're ready to appease or even capitulate. The police are sworn to protect society with their lives, but they will not be supported by weak politicians. They'll be hung out to dry. Their every action will be second-guessed. They're even now collectively slandered as racists. The Minneapolis City Council is at this very moment deliberating on whether to disband the police. In Los Angeles, a measure to partly defund the police and divert the money to black radicals has been approved. Consider what happened in the French Revolution. King Louis XVI, seeing an insurrection being prepared and wishing to spare the lives of his subjects, put himself into the hands of the revolutionaries. He said, Gentlemen, I come here to avoid a great crime. I think I cannot be safer than with you." He abandoned his palace and gave up the protection of his Swiss guard. The revolutionaries, having the king in their custody, ordered the Swiss guard to lay down their weapons and surrender. "We should think ourselves dishonored," replied the guard. "We are Swiss, and the Swiss do not part with their arms, but with their lives." Heavy fighting began in and around the palace. The Swiss defended themselves. The revolutionaries were infuriated by the resistance. Louis XVI heard of the fighting and ordered his guard to lay down their arms at once. They attempted to obey and were slaughtered. Of the 900 Swiss guards, 600 were killed immediately. Another 200 died of wounds or were murdered later on. Here's the summary of the whole process. To avoid bloodshed, the king gave himself up. His guard was slaughtered. The king was later beheaded by the revolutionaries who had previously promised his safety. His wife, the queen, was beheaded. His children were imprisoned. Thousands of innocent persons were beheaded in turn. The Paris mob dominated the politics of those years until a young artillery officer named Napoleon Bonaparte fired grape shot point blank into the Paris mob and dispersed them. No more mob. Guess who the country's next ruler was? Do we have any bold, capable leaders in the U.S. military? Presently, the Army leadership is terrified that racial division within the armed forces will break the Army into mutually hostile camps. It's impolitic, they say, to use the military to stop the burning and pillaging of the leftist revolutionaries. And so, even the army generals have bent the knee. The Chinese troops, when they arrive, will tell them to get up off their knees. The Chinese will hand them shovels and order them to dig. And when the holes are sufficiently deep, shots will ring out. Then, body after body will fall into the holes. And the People's Liberation Army will, with soft dirt, cover the holes into which the corpses have dropped. To our politically correct jackasses, you ought to be ashamed, because you're a pack of unmanned, sniveling, disgusting, senseless, dead men walking. You've earned the fate that's in store for you. You die on your knees because of your foul, weak-minded, moral cowardice. Tomorrow, they will burn the suburbs and decimate you. And while you're digging your grave for the nice Chinese soldiers, I want these words to be burned into your mind. You betrayed your country for 30 years of peace and prosperity. When your enemy took over the schools, you didn't care. When everything at the store was made by your enemy, you liked the low prices. When your enemy ran for Congress and the White House, you voted for him, and you congratulated yourself on being virtuous. But you aren't virtuous. You're cowards. You went along with the communist lies. You flattered yourself about winning the Cold War. You pretended that China was a country that we could do business with. But now, the time has come for you to suffer.